In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing you my Death Knight build. This is a level 150 version of the Deathblade build that sort of carries it even further and shows how well the Sword of Night and Flame can be used throughout the course of the game. So as I mentioned in the previous video, if you happen to see that one, the fire damage of the Sword of Night and Flame scales with Faith, and the magic damage scales with Intelligence, and the physical damage scales with Strength and Dexterity, although very poorly. I have chosen with my build to focus on the magic damage using the weapon ability that is the L2 holding and then using the R1 pull instead of R2 for the fire. You can still do reasonable damage with the fire ability in this setup. However, you're going to do far more with the magic one. We're skewed very heavily towards the magic side. And the reason for that is because I chose this ability because its range is better and I feel like it's more reliably used. There are scenarios where the fire one works very, very well, and I'm not saying it doesn't work well at all. However, I do really like the range that the Night Comet ability of this casts. I feel like it's far more viable in a lot of places, especially when you're using Ancient Deathranker to stagger enemies. That gives you a really good opening to channel that into them. With that in mind, I've set my stats in a way that's going to benefit the magic damage ability of this weapon and the magic damage more than the fire damage. Just keep in mind, though, that the actual scaling on the weapon isn't great to begin with in terms of, like you can see the difference here at 80 Intelligence and 25 Faith. I'm only getting 60 more magic damage than I am getting fire damage on the weapon. So that's not a lot for, 55 points. Now, when it comes to the staff for this build, you'll notice that I've changed to the Carrion Regal Scepter, and that's because we have 80 Intelligence here, and the sorcery scaling is actually better with such high Intelligence and such low Faith than would the Prince of Death staff be in the same scenario. I have tested the two, and you come out much, much farther ahead with the Carrion Regal Scepter, even using death spells. The Prince of Death staff buffs death spells, but even with that extra buff, you're still doing more damage with Ancient Deathranker, so I made the switch here. My mistake in the previous video was assuming that I would have enough stat spread in order to get my Faith higher, in order to get closer to this number with the Carrion Regal Scepter, and then have the 10% push it over the damage that the Carrion Regal Scepter would do. But unfortunately, at 150, we just can't hit those highest stats without sacrificing too much health, without sacrificing too much mind, without sacrificing, endurance and stuff like that. So if you take this build up to 200, you'll probably swap over to that staff, but it's going to be a bit higher before that makes sense. Besides that, I'm also using the Frenzied Flame Seal here. I don't have it upgraded. I only use it to cast Golden Vow. That's really all I use it for. And it weighs nothing, which is why I'm using this one. You could use the Golden Order Seal if you want. It sort of makes sense, given that it scales off both your Intelligence and your Faith. However, because we have such low Faith, you're not going to have access to a ton of spells, and your incantation scaling will be a bit less than if you had split your stats between Intelligence and Faith. Besides these, I am using the Carrion Knight Shield to give me a shield to do block counters and to be able to block enemies with. It's very light. We meet the requirements because we have the Intelligence, and it sort of fits the Knight theme. It also has relatively decent guard boost at 60 when fully upgraded. When it comes to armor, I'm using a mix of the Knight's Cavalry set and Lionel's set, and the reason for that is I really like the way the Knight's Cavalry fits for this build, but it doesn't have enough poise. It's got decent protection, but it doesn't have enough poise, and I wanted more poise, and even though you can add like the Bull Goat's Talisman in order to increase your poise, you're just better off using heavier armor, and using something like the Great Jar's Arsenal in order to boost your equip weight so that you can wear heavier armor that gives you more protection and still gives you about the same amount of poise. And so what I did was I essentially mixed the Knight's Cavalry with Lionel's Greaves and its gloves, so it kind of looks like the Knight's Cavalry set, but it gives you more poise. And the reason we want that poise is because when you're using Night Comet, you can get hit, and a lot of times it'll stagger you out. One little bump, and you get staggered out of that animation. Well, now you have enough poise in it that you can take a direct hit and still continue to channel that attack, which is good. This will allow you to get this attack off much more often, and if you're using the Sword of Night and Flame, this can be one of the most pain-in-the-ass things to deal with, is the fact that if you mistime it even a little bit, you don't get any damage a lot of the time. So with this, you'll be allowed to continue your animation and finish off enemies. You can actually use the Imp's Helmet here as well. That'll give you 2 Intelligence. It has relatively good poise. It has relatively good protection. It doesn't really look great, but it will, if you're trying to min-max absolutely, then it's a good fit here. When it comes to talismans for this build, I'm using Shard of Alexander, Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, Magic Scorpion Charm, and Great Jar's Arsenal. I think I explained myself already why I'm using Great Jar's Arsenal. I wanted the extra poise. This allows us to get the armor to get that poise, so that's why I'm using it. Magic Scorpion Charm is there to boost the damage of Night Comet, your attacks with your regular attacks, and also the spells that we're using for this build because they deal magic damage. Assassin's Cerulean Dagger is there in order to give you a way to replenish FP. You don't have a ton of mind with this build because you're going to be casting spells often, you're going to be using Night Comet often. And it was between this and Carrion Filigree Crest to reduce the cost of, the ability for Sword of Night and Flame. However, I just felt like, you're going to be casting spells too, so when you're casting spells, you're not getting anything back. But this way, if you do like a block counter off your shield, or you do like a charged R2 and stagger an enemy or backstab them, you're getting FP back. And I feel like universally that's going to give you more FP than the Carrion Filigree Crest with this build. And lastly, we have Shard of Alexander, which increases the damage with your weapon abilities with the Sword of Night and Flame. Another honorable mention here would be the Ritual Sword Talisman, as this boosts your damage by 10% when you're at full health, and this includes your spells and weapon attacks. So it's perfect for this build. I didn't use it here because I tend to not stay at 100% health all the time. However, if you're more confident, or you would like to boost your damage, with your spells instead of just your weapon art, you could swap out Shard of Alexander, or you could swap out Magic Scorpion Charm, or you could swap out Assassin's Cerulean Dagger if you have a lot more FP flasks. So the way this build generally works is that I'll buff with Golden Vow, which increases my damage by 15%. It gives me extra defenses, so when I'm running around, my spells hit harder, my weapon attacks hit harder, my weapon abilities hit harder, and if you do block counters, they hit harder, etc. And then I'll try and block counter regular enemies, or just, charged R2, stagger them, and then finish them off with a critical attack in order to get, FP back with Assassin's Cerulean Dagger in some way. And then when I get to difficult enemies, I'll usually cast Ancient Deathranker. If I can have time to set up before I can, fight them, like if they aren't aggroed, I'll drop Terra Magica on the ground, and then I'll start casting Ancient Deathranker. This will increase the damage of that significantly. And then when they start coming at me, I'll wind up and use Night Comet with the Sword of Night and Flame to try and blast them real quick and finish them off while the Ancient Deathranker is slamming into them. For more difficult bosses, or ones that have like heads you can target, or very big enemies, I like to, spam Ancient Deathranker. We have regular Ranker as well. It's cheaper, it doesn't do as much damage. It's probably better for like trash enemies where you just like need to pick off something from far away, like it's a trash enemy that's going to snipe you. That way you save the FP cost. But Ancient Deathranker is really your bread and butter here because it staggers enemies, it does incredible damage, it has really, really good tracking because it moves slowly, which allows you to just cast it, forget about it, not worry about missing the target, especially if they're moving very, very fast. A lot of people knock the damage of Ancient Deathranker, but what they don't understand is that it doesn't hardly ever miss. Like, it just doesn't miss very often, and that's really what's so reliable about the spell. You cast it, forget about it, go on doing whatever you're doing, cast it again, forget about it. You don't have to like try and time your cast because the enemy's aggressive and it'll dodge right by your Comet spell or your, Great Glintstone Shard or whatever. It just doesn't miss, so it's really, really good in that way. You can, of course, add other spells to this build. These are the 4 that I use mostly: Golden Vow, Terra Magica, Ranker, Ancient Deathranker. But obviously, because you have 80, in intelligence, you can use whatever you want. Full Moon is a great candidate for this build as well. That reduces the resistances of the enemy, which will allow your magic damage to hit even harder. When it comes to stats for this build, I have 40 Vigor, 30 Mind, 21 Endurance, 12 Strength, 12 Dexterity, 80 Intelligence, 25 Faith, and 9 Arcane. Vigor is at 40 for this build. I would like it to be higher, but in order to get max damage out of spells and your weapon ability, we have it at 40. If you increase this build higher, you might want to go up to 50 or 60. I would highly recommend it. You could even drop Intelligence down to like 75 and get some more Vigor here if you're having a hard time. 30 Mind is there because the weapon ability of Night and Flame is quite expensive, as is Ancient Deathranker, and Golden Vow is not cheap. So you're going to be using these quite regularly, and you need a decent FP pool, or you're going to be chugging pots all the time. And you don't want to get like 2 casts off in combat and then have to chug a pot and get 2 casts off and chug a pot. That's just bad. So this will allow you to get away with less FP flasks and still be able to cast a lot in combat. 21 Endurance is there to meet the requirement for the equip load we need for this build and be able to medium roll. Keep in mind we have Great Jar's Arsenal there as well, boosting our equip load. So that really helps us be able to keep points out of Endurance, which we need for all these other stats. 12 Strength and Dexterity are needed to meet the requirements of Night and Flame. These, when increased, boost the damage of the Night and Flame sword, but not its weapon abilities, and it scales very, very poorly with these, so I don't recommend increasing them. 80 Intelligence is there, as I mentioned, in order to get the most out of our spells, as well as the most out of the Night Comet ability from the Sword of Night and Flame, so that's why we did that. And 25 Faith is not only there to meet the requirements for the Sword of Night and Flame, which requires 24, but then 1 more point in order to use Golden Vow to boost our damage and defenses. And you don't need Arcane for this build. One final tip before I wrap up the video: I do like to use the Magic Shroud and Cracked here to increase my magic damage for a significant portion of time when playing with this build. That's going to affect your regular weapon attacks, your weapon ability with Night Comet, your spells. It's really good. It lasts a very good long time. And then I also like to use the Green Burst one, in order to recover stamina. That way I can keep spamming spells, or I can block and dodge and then get a spell off and still be able to move around and dodge as needed. But you could use the one that increases intelligence as well if you'd like more damage and you're not having trouble with stamina. Stay tuned for more Elden Ring builds as we finish up the evolutions of our level 100 builds and add a couple new ones as well.